Sophie Gardner's shoulders ached as she trudged toward the bus stop. 3 morning classes followed by an 8-hour shift at Brewed Awakening, the local coffee shop that helped cover her half of the rent, had left her drained. The November wind cut through her thin blue hoodie, a harsh reminder that winter was closing in and she still couldn't afford a proper coat. The number 42 bus pulled up right on time. Sophie climbed aboard, flashed her monthly pass to the driver, a grumpy, middle-aged man with permanently furrowed brows, and slumped into a seat near the back. She leaned her forehead against the cool window, watching the city lights blur together as exhaustion settled deep into her bones. "Wait!" A male voice called out just as the doors began to close. The driver sighed but reopened them, allowing a young man in his early 20s to jump aboard, slightly out of breath. He wore jeans and a simple gray sweater that somehow looked expensive despite its plainness. His dark hair was windswept, and there was something about his confident posture that made several passengers glance up. "That'll be $3.50, the driver announced flatly. The young man patted his pockets, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to growing panic. "I'm sorry, I think I left my wallet in my other," he stopped mid-sentence, embarrassment creeping onto his face. "No money, no ride," the driver stated, pointing toward the door. "I've got a schedule to keep." Sophie watched the exchange, recognizing the look of humiliation. Without thinking, she stood up, reached into her pocket, and pulled out the loose change she had received as a tip earlier. "Here," she said, handing over $3.25. "I've got it." The young man turned to her, surprise flickering in his hazel eyes. For a moment, he looked like he was about to refuse, but then he nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I'll pay you back somehow." "Don't worry about it," Sophie replied with a tired smile before returning to her seat. The young man took a spot a few rows ahead, glancing back at her occasionally. But Sophie barely noticed, already lost in thoughts about tomorrow's exam and whether her mom had remembered to take her medication. What she couldn't know was that she had just helped Ethan Carter, whose family owned the Carter Grand Hotels, spanning 3 continents. The same Ethan whose face occasionally appeared in business magazines next to headlines about the hotel empire he would one day inherit. He looked back once more at the girl in the blue hoodie, now resting against the window, her eyes closed despite her obvious exhaustion. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar, a connection that had nothing to do with his last name or his family's wealth. As the bus rumbled through the city streets, 2 worlds briefly intersected, neither aware that this small moment would change everything. Sophie's fingers moved swiftly across the espresso machine, steaming milk, grinding beans, and pouring perfect Rosetta patterns into cups. After 2 years at Brewed Awakening, the morning rush had become second nature. A long line of caffeine-deprived customers stretched to the door. "Grande caramel latte with almond milk," she called out, sliding the cup across the counter without looking up. "Thanks," a familiar voice replied. Sophie glanced up and froze. Standing before her was the young man from the bus, the one she had helped yesterday. In the daylight, she noticed details she had missed in the dim bus lighting, a sharp jawline, intelligent eyes, and that same expensive-looking simplicity in his clothes. "It's you," she said, surprise evident in her voice. He smiled. "Told you I'd pay you back. For $3.50, you didn't have to come all this way." "Maybe I just wanted good coffee too," he said with a playful glint in his eyes. "I'm Ethan, by the way." "Sophie," she answered automatically. Her coworker Lisa nudged her urgently. "We've got 6 people waiting on drinks," Lisa whispered. "Right, sorry." Sophie turned back to Ethan. "I need to." "Of course," he said, dropping a $5 bill into the tip jar. "Thanks again." Sophie watched as he chose a table by the window, pulling out a book instead of a phone, something oddly refreshing. Throughout her shift, she caught him glancing up occasionally, their eyes meeting briefly before both looked away. When the rush finally died down, Sophie grabbed a rag and started wiping nearby tables. "So," she said as she approached his table, "do you make a habit of forgetting your wallet?" Ethan laughed, closing his book. "Not usually. Yesterday was unusual." "How so?" "Let's just say I'm trying something different with my life." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Mysterious." "Not intentionally." His expression turned sincere. "Actually, I came back because—" He hesitated. "This might sound strange, but you're the first person who's done something nice for me without expecting anything in return." "It was just bus fare," Sophie said, confused by his intensity. "Still, I'd like to thank you properly. Maybe coffee sometime, when you're not working." Sophie studied him, trying to read his intentions. There was something he wasn't saying, but his eyes seemed genuine. "I don't even know you." "That's the point of coffee, isn't it? To get to know someone." Before she could answer, her manager called from behind the counter. "Sophie, break's over." "I'm here most mornings," Ethan said quickly. "Think about it." Sophie nodded hesitantly before returning to work. Throughout the day, she found herself glancing at the spot where he had sat, now occupied by a student with headphones. She told herself it was ridiculous to feel disappointed when he didn't show up the next day, but when he appeared the following morning, casually ordering a black coffee and asking how her day was going, something warm flickered to life inside her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time, long ago. What began as coincidence was quickly becoming routine, though. Sophie had no idea just how complicated that routine would become. "So let me get this straight," Sophie said, stirring her latte. "You just decided to quit your corporate job and start over?" It was their 5th coffee meetup in 2 weeks, this time after her shift ended. Ethan sat across from her at a small table in the back corner of Brood Awakening, his expression thoughtful. "Something like that," he replied. "The family business. It wasn't who I wanted to be." Sophie nodded, understanding more than he realized. "My dad was like that. Had this whole life planned out for me, college, law school, joining his firm. When I chose art history instead, he stopped paying for anything." She shrugged, trying to make it seem less painful than it was. "Haven't spoken to him in 3 years. Ethan leaned forward. "That's rough. Is that why you work so many hours here?" "That, and helping Mom with rent. She's got health issues." Sophie surprised herself with her candor. Something about Ethan made it easy to open up. "Anyway, enough about my sad backstory. What are you doing now, job-wise?" Ethan shifted in his seat. "Freelance consulting. Nothing exciting." "Mr. Mysterious strikes again," Sophie teased. "You never talk about your past. Because it's boring compared to hearing about your passion for Renaissance art." Sophie rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. Smooth deflection. The coffee shop was nearly empty now. Outside, streetlights flickered on as dusk settled over the city. Sophie should have been heading home. She had reading to finish for tomorrow's class, but she found herself reluctant to end their conversation. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said, his tone suddenly serious. "Depends on the question. What do you want? Like, really want out of life?" Sophie blinked, surprised by the directness. "I want to finish my degree, get a job at a museum. Someday, maybe curate my own exhibition." She paused. "And not worry about money constantly. That would be nice." "That's it? No dreams of world travel or mansions?" "Those things cost money I don't have," she laughed. "I'm practical. But if money wasn't an issue..." Sophie thought for a moment. "Then I'd take my mom to Italy. She's always wanted to see Florence." She tilted her head. "Your turn. What do you want, Ethan, whatever your last name is?" He smiled, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. "Freedom. To just be me, not what others expect." "And who is the real you?" Sophie asked softly. "I'm still figuring that out." His gaze met hers. "But I feel more like myself when I'm with you than I have in a long time." The confession hung between them, honest and unguarded. Sophie felt a flutter in her chest that both excited and terrified her. "I should go," she said finally, gathering her things. "Early class tomorrow." Ethan nodded, walking her to the door. "Same time next week. Maybe sooner." Sophie hesitated, then added, "There's a student exhibition at my college Friday night. Nothing fancy, but..." "I'd love to go," Ethan said immediately. As they parted ways outside, Sophie realized that for the first time in years, she was letting someone new into her carefully constructed world. She wasn't sure if it was wise, but something about Ethan made her want to take the risk. What she didn't see was Ethan's face after she left, the conflict and guilt shadowing his features as he pulled out a phone much more expensive than his simple clothes would suggest. The university gallery buzzed with conversation as students and faculty milled around, examining artwork displayed on pristine white walls. Sophie stood beside a series of photographs. Not her work, but those of a friend who'd asked her to explain them to visitors. He's exploring urban decay as a metaphor for forgotten communities, she explained to an elderly professor, who nodded with polite interest. Her eyes kept drifting to the entrance. Ethan was 20 minutes late, and Sophie was beginning to think he wouldn't show. She checked her phone, no messages. "Sorry I'm late," a voice said behind her. Sophie turned to find Ethan slightly out of breath, his hair windblown. "Couldn't find parking." "You drove?" Sophie asked, surprised. "I thought you took the bus." "Borrowed a friend's car," Ethan explained quickly. "This exhibition meant a lot to you, so—" Sophie smiled, letting her suspicion fade. "I'm glad you made it. Let me show you around." As they walked through the gallery, Sophie noticed a few things that didn't quite add up. Ethan's simple watch, which he kept trying to hide under his sleeve, looked suspiciously like the luxury brand she'd seen in magazine ads. His knowledge of art was surprisingly sophisticated for someone who claimed to have a standard business background. And when he received a call, he stepped away to speak in hushed tones, returning with a tightness around his eyes. "Everything okay?" Sophie asked. "Just work," he muttered. "Sorry about that." Later, as they stood before a striking abstract painting, Sophie gathered her courage. "Ethan, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Who are you really? Sometimes I feel like you're hiding something." Ethan stiffened. "What do you mean?" Sophie gestured vaguely. "That watch you're wearing costs more than my semester's tuition. You know way too much about 16th century Italian masters for someone who took one art history class in college. And whenever I ask about your family or where you live, you change the subject." "I told you, I worked in corporate." "Which corporation?" Sophie pressed. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, Sophie. Try me." He hesitated, then slipped the watch off his wrist. "It was my grandfather's family heirloom." Sophie wanted to believe him. The past few weeks with Ethan had been the brightest spot in her otherwise exhausting life. When they were together, talking about books, debating the merits of different artistic movements, she felt understood in a way she never had before. "I like you, Sophie," Ethan said quietly. "Isn't that what matters?" A part of her wanted to push further, to demand the full truth. But the vulnerability in his eyes made her pause. "Just don't lie to me, okay?" she said finally. "I've had enough people walk out of my life. I don't need more disappointment." Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm not going anywhere." As they continued through the gallery, Sophie told herself to be content with what Ethan was willing to share. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was only seeing a carefully constructed version of him, a canvas with significant portions left deliberately blank. What she didn't realize was how quickly those blank spaces would be filled in, whether Ethan wanted them to be or not. As she walked him to the door, Sophie lowered her voice to a whisper. "She loves you, I can tell." Ethan pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "Sophie, there's something I need to tell you." Her brows knitted with concern. "What is it?" she asked, searching his troubled expression. The words caught in his throat. How could he explain that he wasn't just some regular guy? That his family controlled a billion-dollar empire and soon he'd have to return to a world where people like Sophie didn't even exist? He exhaled sharply. "Nothing," he said finally. "Just, thank you for tonight." As he kissed her goodbye, Ethan knew his time was running out. The truth would come out, whether he was ready or not. The usual Wednesday afternoon rush at Brood Awakening had finally slowed. Sophie wiped down the espresso machine, humming softly. The past few weeks with Ethan had felt like something out of a dream. Late-night conversations, weekend walks through the park, stolen kisses during her shifts. For once, her life felt balanced, even with her packed schedule. "Can I get a cappuccino?" a voice asked. Sophie looked up to see a woman in her 30s, sharp-eyed, with a press badge hanging around her neck. "Coming right up," Sophie replied, starting the drink. The bell above the door chimed, and Ethan walked in. His face lit up as he spotted Sophie, but the moment was short-lived. His smile faltered as he caught sight of a businessman from his father's company standing in line. The man squinted at him, then pulled out his phone. "No way. Ethan." Ethan's body went rigid, his blood turning ice-cold. A few customers turned to look. "You look different," the man said, eyeing Ethan's worn jeans and coffee-stained sweater. Before Ethan could react, a woman's voice cut through the cafe. Ethan Carter. The journalist was already pulling out her phone. What are you doing here? Sophie froze, the name hitting her like a slap. Carter. As in Carter Grand Hotels. As in the luxury hotel chain whose billboards loomed over the city. Ethan's face paled. Melissa, don't. Too late. The journalist snapped several photos before he could stop her. Does your father know you're slumming it in coffee shops? Or is this some kind of publicity stunt? Sophie felt the room tilt. The cappuccino machine beeped, milk overflowing onto the counter, but she barely noticed. Ethan Carter, she repeated, her voice hollow. As in, the Hotel Empire? Melissa smirked, glancing between them as realization dawned. Oh, this is rich. Literally. She turned to Sophie. Honey, do you work here? How long have you known him? She's not part of this, Ethan snapped. Leave her alone. But the damage was done. The journalist was already typing on her phone, her expression triumphant. Hotel Air Ethan Carter spotted at local coffee shop. New life, or just a game? Sophie moved mechanically, wiping up the spilled milk, but her mind raced. Every moment with Ethan, every conversation, was suddenly cast in a different light. Sophie, please, Ethan pleaded, stepping toward her. Lisa, her co-worker, folded her arms. You're that Ethan Carter. Sophie turned sharply. You knew. Lisa shook her head. No. But now it makes sense. You always tipped too much. And that watch, I thought it was fake, but now. She scoffed, looking disgusted. Ethan swallowed hard, guilt weighing down on him. Sophie took a shaky step back. Were you ever going to tell me? Yes, he insisted. I was just trying to find the right time. The right time? Sophie's voice cracked. The right time was before I fell for you, not after everyone else already figured it out. Lisa reappeared from the back. Everything okay, Soph? Fine, Sophie managed. I'm taking my break. Without another word, she untied her apron and walked off, disappearing into the staff room. Only when she shut the door behind her did she allow the tears to fall. Sophie walked briskly out the back exit of the cafe, her shift over but the humiliation still burning fresh. She just needed to get away. Sophie, wait. Ethan called, following her into the alley. Leave me alone, Ethan, she shot back, quickening her pace. Just give me 5 minutes, he begged. She whirled around, eyes blazing. 5 minutes? You had 2 months to tell me the truth. 2 months of watching me count tips, stress over my mom's medical bills, while you, what? Played poor for fun. It wasn't like that, Ethan said desperately. When we met on that bus, I was trying to experience life without the Carter name. For once, I just wanted someone to see me. Sophie let out a bitter laugh. But it wasn't just you, was it? It was a character you created. The struggling consultant, the humble guy rebuilding his life. God, I feel so stupid. Everything I told you about myself, my thoughts, my feelings, what I want from life, that was all real, Ethan insisted. Except the part where you're heir to a billion-dollar empire. Sophie shook her head. That's not some minor detail, Ethan. That's your entire life. People passed by on the main street, glancing curiously at their heated exchange. Sophie forced herself to take a steadying breath, lowering her voice. Do you know what the worst part is? She asked quietly. I trusted you. I let you meet my mom. I told you things I've never told anyone. And all that time, you were lying. Ethan reached for her hand, but she stepped away. Sophie, I was going to tell you. I swear, I didn't know how to do it without losing you. Well, you figured out how to lose me anyway. She pulled her phone from her pocket, turning the screen toward him. The journalist's post had already been shared thousands of times, complete with photos of Ethan at the cafe. Speculation about his secret romance with a barista was spreading like wildfire. By tomorrow, everyone will know. My co-workers. My classmates. Her voice wavered. Was it worth it? Your little experiment in being normal. Ethan's face crumpled. You were never part of an experiment. What I feel for you is real. Sophie swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I don't even know who you are. Please don't contact me again." Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked away, each step carrying her further from the future she'd foolishly begun to imagine. Behind her, Ethan remained frozen in place, watching the only real connection he'd ever known disappear around the corner. Ethan pulled out a photo of Sophie from his wallet, a snapshot he'd taken one afternoon at the park, capturing her mid-laugh as autumn leaves swirled around her. Sometimes, he thought about calling her, telling her about his new life, asking for another chance. But what right did he have? Sophie deserved someone who had been honest from the start. Still, on nights like this, with the weight of the Carter legacy finally lifted off his shoulders, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a different ending. One where he had found the courage to tell her the truth before it was too late. Maybe, someday, he'd be worthy of a second chance. For now, learning to be himself was enough. "You should go find him," Lisa said, sliding a freshly made latte across the counter to Sophie. It had been 3 months since Sophie learned the truth about Ethan, 3 months of throwing herself into work and school, trying to move on. But the ache remained, stubborn and persistent. "And say what?" Sophie replied, wiping down the espresso machine. "Hey, remember me? The girl you lied to for months." Lisa rolled her eyes. "James told you where Ethan is, some mountain lodge, right? What's stopping you?" Sophie had shared the encounter with James weeks ago, but had conveniently left out the part where he'd slipped her a note with Ethan's whereabouts. The Pinewood Lodge. 6 hours north by bus. Pride, Sophie admitted finally. And fear. That evening, she sat across from her mother at their tiny kitchen table. Maria's health had improved slightly in recent weeks, allowing her to cook dinner for the first time in months. "He lied to me," Sophie said abruptly, stabbing at her food with her fork. "For weeks, maybe months. And now he just walks away, like that changes anything." Maria studied her daughter carefully. "And yet, you're still thinking about him." Sophie sighed, leaning back. "I hate that I am." She crossed her arms. "But I need to know if he really changed, or if he's just playing another role." Maria nodded knowingly. "Then go find out." Sophie looked up in surprise. "I wondered when you'd make that decision," Maria said. "You check business news websites daily. You've barely dated since he left. And sometimes, you say his name in your sleep." She reached across the table and took Sophie's hand. "The question isn't whether you should go. It's why you haven't already." Later that night, Sophie pulled out her laptop and looked up bus schedules. The ticket would eat into her savings, money she'd been putting aside for next semester's books. Was Ethan worth the risk? She remembered his face the last time she saw him, devastated, pleading. And she remembered her own anger. Justified, but perhaps incomplete. There were 2 sides to every story, and she'd only allowed herself to see one. She thought about what James had told her, about Ethan walking away from everything he'd ever known, searching for something real in a world built on appearances. Wasn't that what she wanted too? Authenticity in a world of masks. Before she could change her mind, Sophie booked the ticket for Friday, after her final exam and before her weekend shift. She'd have exactly 24 hours to find Ethan, say what she needed to say, and return. What would she say when she saw him? Sophie wasn't sure. Part of her wanted to scream at him again for his deception. Another part wanted to understand why he had chosen this path. And a small, persistent voice wondered if they could start over. This time, with no lies between them, she closed her laptop. Sophie felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The Pinewood Lodge looked exactly like its website photos, rustic, charming, and worlds away from the luxury hotels that bore the Carter name. Sophie stood at the edge of the gravel parking lot, gripping her small overnight bag. Doubt flooded her mind. What if Ethan didn't want to see her? What if he had moved on? What if this entire trip was a mistake? Before she could reconsider, the lodge's front door swung open. A family emerged, laughing as they headed toward their car. Sophie took a deep breath and walked forward. The reception area smelled of pine and coffee. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, and hiking maps covered one wall. Behind the desk, an older man with a gray beard looked up as she entered. "Welcome to Pinewood," he said warmly. "Checking in." Sophie hesitated. "Actually, I'm looking for someone who works here." "Ethan Carter." The man's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "And you are?" "Sophie Gardner." "I'm a friend." Before he could respond, a door behind the desk opened, and Ethan stepped through, carrying a stack of fresh towels. He froze when he saw her, nearly dropping them. "Sophie!" His voice was barely a whisper. She drank in the sight of him, his hair longer, his face more tanned. He wore a simple flannel shirt with the lodge's logo. Nothing like the carefully casual, expensive clothes he'd worn when they first met. "Hi," she managed, suddenly at a loss for all the words she had rehearsed on the bus ride. The older man glanced between them. "Take your break, Ethan. I'll cover the desk." Neither spoke as Ethan led her outside to a small patio overlooking the mountains. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, turning everything golden. "You found me," Ethan said finally, leaning against the wooden railing. "James told me where you were," Sophie admitted. "I almost didn't come. I'm glad you did." Ethan's eyes searched her face. "Why did you?" Sophie looked out at the mountains, gathering her thoughts. "I needed to know if any of it was real. Us, I mean." "All of it was real," Ethan replied without hesitation. "Except the parts one didn't tell you." A silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Sophie turned to face him directly. "If money doesn't define you," she asked, "then what does?" Ethan's expression softened, a small smile forming at the corner of his mouth. "Who I choose to be." The simple answer hung in the air between them. And Sophie realized Ethan had found what he'd been searching for all along. Not an escape from his name, but the freedom to define himself on his own terms. "And who is that?" she asked softly. Instead of answering, Ethan extended his hand. "Would you like to find out?"